Hi. So my name is Zooey. To give a small amount of backstory about myself, I dropped out of a philosophy degree, I became a bicycle mechanic, and then I worked in retail, and about 2 years ago I started learning to code. And via the magic of learning and found some coders, I became a software engineer, and I work for a consultancy now called YLD, and at the moment that manifests in me writing React at Trainline. At work, I write JavaScript, and in my dreams/lunch breaks, I study Haskell. So I'm going to talk to you about readability in a slightly roundabout way. So there was this British philosopher called Thomas Hobbes. He described a theoretical human state of the human with no society and no social relations. This is the state of nature. And the state of nature characterized by Hobbes is nasty, brutish, and short. This is based on Hobbes' conception of the human as inherently completely selfish and self-interested, but rational and fundamentally completely equal with one another. The solution, based on the rationality of the human, is the social contract. This is a series of agreements between people that will make everybody's lives better, hence the self-interest. These agreements can be things like, I won't stab you for your porridge if you don't do the same to me. And as a society grows, these kinds of rules can be enforced by that society, and if they're the kind of society who wants a government, maybe they get one of those. As a note, I'm now diverging from Hobbes' thought and adding my sort of own interpretations. So these fundamental ideas, like don't kill each other, are important to the social contract, but there is room for variation within different societies. So one society that has a particularly sensitive palate may have as part of their social contract, don't serve each other spicy food. Whereas another society with a proclivity for flavor may have don't serve anyone bland food. And this is where I come to JavaScript. I would characterize a theoretical JavaScript project without any kind of social contracts akin to Hobbes' state of nature. Nasty, brutish, but prolonged. This is where our social contract comes into place. Just as, in terms of a social contract for a society, we have fundamental concepts that underpin that social contract, like don't murder each other, we can have some fundamental parts of our social contract between other developers, such as don't name variables intentionally misleading things, like array of names equals 42. But these are not the significant aspects of readability in the way it's commonly discussed. We're generally assuming that the intention when writing code is for it to be readable, and people won't engage in these kinds of, at best, effortless naming schemes. So, what is the nature of readability? This may seem unintuitive to examine, but if we're to argue on the pursuit of a goal, we must agree on the fundamental nature of that goal. Take, for example, two people arguing about what makes the best kind of white bread. And one of them thinks the best white bread is a crusty, tangy, savory lump of sourdough. And the other thinks the best is a sweet, soft, buttery brioche. They're inherently going to meet an impasse because they think they're discussing the same thing, that is white bread, but they have completely different conceptions of what makes white bread good. So too is our discussion of readability. We must define our terms in order to understand the concepts we're discussing. So someone once said to me in JavaScript, function declarations were inherently more readable than arrow functions because they included the word function. But this in and of itself misunderstands the nature of language as abstraction. We use language as auditory and visual symbolic representation of concepts, often combining lots of different concepts into one symbol. Verbosity is not readability. And terseness is not the opposite of readability. Let's look at some mathematical notation, mostly because I very recently learned this, and before that I found it immensely confusing. This is two ways to say the same thing for all numbers that are a member of the set of integers. The first notation definitely looks less readable to somebody who is unfamiliar with that kind of syntax. But once we explain that notation, so the inverted A next to the x means for all of some variable x, the weird E-looking thing means member of, and the kind of weird Z means the set of integers. So for all numbers that are a member of the set of integers. Really, I think this is just as readable once we've understood these symbols and how they represent different concepts. But if we're introducing the concepts of set membership and mathematical proofs, environments where it might be useful to talk about for all integers, do we use this syntax? No, because there is a social contract between the student and teacher or the student and learning material based on the assumed understanding and knowledge level of the student. You introduce the concept and then the symbolic representation of the symbolic representation of the concept. The terse syntax is for people who are already familiar with these concepts, for people who having to write out for all repeatedly is laborious. This actually becomes more readable to people who are familiar with this syntax because their eyes have to scan less symbols to understand precisely the same thing. There is less room for misinterpretation because there are less symbols and the symbols are clearer in their meaning. So we can see that depending on your environment, your perspective, your social context, both of these can be considered to be more readable. It depends on who you are and what your situation is and what the social context of that situation leads you to be. Less symbols does not mean less readable. So from this, we can infer that readability is not just the basic understanding of the meanings of symbols, as the kinds of symbols valued is based on the context. So we can see the concept of a function is far more important than the syntax that represents the declaration or application of it, as long as those things are consistent. So if we can't define readability based on symbols used, how can we define it? I would define readability as a set of principles that can be manifested in different ways, that when followed, create a readable codebase. So the first, I would say, a readable codebase is a codebase that solves similar problems in similar ways. That is, it's internally consistent. To give an example, if we had an array of objects and we wanted to map it to an array of a certain value from each object, we could do this in a number of ways. We can use the array.map method and use an arrow function with dot notation to pull off and return that value. We can use the array.map method. We can use destructuring to pull that value off. We can also use a function like prop from a library like Ramda, which is going to return a function awaiting the object and pull that value off in that way using array.map. We can still even use a map function which is applied more like a traditional function rather than like a method, using the same prop function from something like Ramda and putting the array in. I have my own opinions about what the most readable of these are, but that doesn't matter. It matters that you and the people you write code with agree and use the same systems, and that you embrace the system you've chosen. The reason JavaScript lends itself to a lack of readability is the fact that things can be done in so many different ways. So we have to put social rules in place to change the way that we program within this unlimited paradigm. Readable code should also be simple. Within the chosen paradigm, you should always use the simplest solution possible for the problem at hand. Code should also be generic, where possible and appropriate. Note that I say where appropriate. By making code generic and internally consistent stylistically, and with simple solutions, we can see patterns emerge far easier and find better ways to reuse code. Better code reuse means you have to understand less over the whole code base because you're understanding less code. Note, I say generic where appropriate. Inappropriate reuse can make readability and the code base in general far worse. It's important to be generic where appropriate. The social contracts that you have as part of the way you make your code readable must also be actively communicated and explicit. That means they're communicated during onboarding, during code review, during pairing, during the hiring process. And most importantly, they must be communicated thoughtfully and empathetically. The idea of these principles is to make our lives as developers better. And as developers, we're fundamentally human. So this communication must take that into account. The best act of communication to me is in the form of good documentation that's actively maintained. Also, having it as integrated as part of your workflow and automated where possible, so as part of your pre-commit, pre-push, or continuous integration. So I believe that these principles represent what it means for code to be readable. And these principles can be manifested in many different ways. But if, when you are writing code, reading code, and reviewing code, you ask yourself, is this consistent with the style in the code base? Is this using the simplest solution? Is this using the appropriate kind of generic solution for this? You will end up with a far more readable code base. And that captures part of the essence of readability. I think that some paradigms lend themselves to these principles well, in ways that result in easier to write, more readable, more reusable code. But it doesn't really matter that much. I think it's thus that I note that readability is a social contract, based on concepts that we agree to, embrace, and adhere to create consistent, easy to maintain, easy to read code. And yes, these principles can be manifested in many different ways. Also strongly typed functional programming. Programming in a group is a fundamentally social act. And helping to make the code easier to understand and work on involves fundamentally social solutions. You have to talk to each other. Thank you.